Welcome to Knock Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Rabbi Tovia Singer's Let's Get Biblical Q&A, coming to you from the Holy Land. Rabbi, the man Tovia Singer, welcome back, sir. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you. How are you doing, William?
I am doing well. I was thinking about something earlier. I didn't get my schmoozing in with you earlier. I kind of got in. I kind of got in the studio a little last minute, so we can schmooze for a second. Now, how are you?
Well, it's all exciting. We're preparing for the high holidays here in Israel. It's a good thing. Doing really well. They're getting excited for Rosh Hashanah, the new year. It's a funny thing, when I made Aliyah, when I moved to Israel a little more than 2 years ago, one of the things that I noticed, I remember this thought. I remember thinking, wow, this country is really Jewish. It seems crazy, but when you're here as a tourist, it's one thing. But when you live here as a citizen, you realize that the whole country is just. On Rosh Hashanah, the streets are basically closed. Yom Kippur, even the airport's closed. So
wow.
It's like the whole country is celebrating. The whole country is experiencing it. Last night there were so many thousands of people praying at the Western Wall, tens of thousands. It's really very, very special here. You experience Judaism here, whereas you can just practice it in other countries.
That's very well said. Interesting. All right. Well, I guess we should get this baby rolling. Thanks for filling that little void for me. You guys, one of these days, I'm going to surprisingly record Rabbi while we're just talking. We have some of the funniest conversations I've ever had, and I wished I had some that just make a little compilation of all of our fun conversations. I had one that I did, but it was really just like, I don't know. I didn't get enough in there. It was maybe like 3-minute video of just me and you going back and forth. It was kind of funny. So, all right. So let's feet in there. All right, here we go. Okay. Well, we're going to take this caller. Caller, you are live on the air. Please tell us your name and where you're calling from.
Hello, my name is Phil Kelton. I'm calling from Ocala, Florida. I'm Jewish.
Welcome.
My question is, why and who would make up this big hoax about Christianity? It doesn't make any sense to me. And, why attach it to Judaism and the Torah? What do they hope to gain? I just don't understand the whole aspect of that. So, anyway, that's a very simple question. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Go ahead and hang up now. You can tune in for your answer. I hear that question a lot. Kind of with a similar spin to it. If Christianity is so fake, why would they even try to pair themselves with Judaism if it was so obviously wrong? So anyway, loving to hear this answer. Go ahead.
Yeah, you see the result of this today. Christians, no doubt, look at Jewish people and are absolutely bewildered as to why Jewish people do not accept Jesus as the Messiah. How could a people who won so many Nobel Prizes, it's their Bible after all, written in the language that essentially only they understand, the book that is theirs, that was given to them, how could a people who have such a reputation for being that clever, and the very people who were around not only at the time, but in the place geographically, the Jews were in the land of Israel at the time, how could the Jews miss this point? I'm talking about nice Christians, good people. They're just absolutely bewildered by the rejection of the Jewish people to the claims of the church. Conversely, there are Jewish people, religious Jews, wonder, I think, kind of what is lying behind the caller's question. And that is, why would Christians believe such a thing? Jewish people are, especially when learning about the beliefs of the church, and even more so learning about to what extent the early church went to alter the Jewish scriptures, to concoct passages that don't exist, to rip passages out of context. Like, why would anyone even believe this? How could sensible Christians even begin to believe something that bears no resemblance to what the Hebrew Bible has to say about the Messiah? So there's a lot of bewilderment here, and I address this in volume 1 of Let's Get Biblical in my introduction to Isaiah 53 and a number of other places in the 2-volume work. How could this ever happen? There's a problem in addressing this, and that is there's a dearth of information, first century information on how Christianity was born, because as it turns out, there's not a single non-Christian writer, historian that made any comment about Christianity during the first century. The first indisputed writer that's not a Christian to even mention Christianity is Pliny the Younger in 112, Tacitus in 114. Important Roman figures, historians, but that's 2nd century, very, very long after the fact. And it's widely known that what we find in Josephus, who is not a contemporary could not have been a contemporary of Jesus, what is found in antiquities, written at the very end of the 1st century, is a later Christian invention. What we find in Antiquities 1833, Testimonium Flavium, is an interpolation of the church. So we're really dealing with very little information. But it isn't difficult to figure out what might have occurred here, because we do know that in the 1st century, Judaism was the only monotheism that existed. There was nothing else. It's not like today where there are a number of monotheistic faiths. Judaism was the only monotheism. All other religions in the Greco-Roman world were henotheistic, or just pagan in a very raw, ancient sense, but radical monotheism, Unitarian, only Judaism embraced that. And Judaism, as it turns out, was a popular faith, and the area of the land of Israel was a very important place, which historians wrote about. It was a very significant part of the world. But who then was Jesus? So it's hard to put your finger on this, but you can get a sense that at the time in the 1st century, that was a very difficult time. The 1st century was a time when the people who lived here, the Jewish people who lived in the land of Israel, were living under an occupation. We were living under the thumb of the Roman Empire. We were living during a very, very difficult time with leaders from, let's say, from the Herodian family, some of them were absolutely nuts. Very, very difficult times. And the empire was at its height. And it would have been inconceivable for anyone to imagine during the 1st century that you can overthrow the empire, because the empire was so great. How was that even possible? The only possible way that the empire could be destroyed, the Roman Empire, was through what's called an apocalyptic eschatology, that essentially the end of the world was coming, and this would happen by a dynamic movement of God, something where just God completely intervenes in history, and the empire is destroyed. And prepare yourself for the end of the world, essentially. The end of the world as you know it, the end of the empire as you know it. And we even see this in the Christian Bible. There are quite a number of people running around making a claim that the end of the world's coming, and making a claim that they're the Messiah, or in some way have some role in this eschatology. Incidentally, it would be this kind of declaration, it would be this kind of chatter that would get you crucified. The Roman Empire made it a point to execute people by crucifixion who in any way undermined the empire, had any kind of message that would destabilize the empire. They wouldn't, if you committed other crimes, so crucifixion typically would not be the manner of execution, because crucifixion was a very expensive. But crucifixion was used really for those who committed treason against the empire, and they wanted to make an example out of you in a very public way. So it's very possible that the figure around whom Christianity was created went around saying that the end of the world is coming, just like we see other figures in the Christian Bible making that claim, asserting that the end is near, prepare yourself, and so on. And perhaps that's why, John the Baptist is running around, had quite a following. I have no doubt that John the Baptist was a real historical figure, and the early church would connect Jesus to John the Baptist to lend credibility to Jesus's importance. And Luke would go so far that in his infancy narrative, John the Baptist wasn't just a figure who held Jesus in high esteem, but he was actually family. Now, it's very possible there are people at that time who were thinking that maybe Jesus had some role in the end of days. But when he was executed, then that would have disconfirmed any belief that they would have had that he could have been a messianic figure, because that's exactly what he's not supposed to do. He's not supposed to die. He's supposed to instead defeat the enemies of God and usher in a messianic hope in a time prophesied in the Jewish scriptures where world peace would seize the world, and the knowledge of God, the universal knowledge of God, would fill the world. That's exactly what the Messiah wasn't supposed to do. But there were people who hung on to this view. It's very possible, I've said this in other shows we've done. I remember when I served as rabbi in Indonesia, and there was a very famous Christian figure in Indonesia who was there when I served as rabbi. He was known as Peter the Great. His name was Petrus. He was, for many people, this is surprising that there would be an enormously successful Christian leader in Indonesia, because most people associate Indonesia with the largest Muslim country, or the country with the largest Muslim population in the world, which it is. So people associate Indonesia with Islam. But as it turns out, Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world, and it has a considerable Christian population of somewhere in the order of, let's say, 25, 30 million Christians. And to my knowledge, there are no atheists in Indonesia. If there are, I never met them. It's just a very religious place. And the Christians in Indonesia were had a lot of power, enormous, very influential. And this guy was he was huge. He was like, in America, Benny Hinn. He was a prosperity preacher. He would fill stadiums with Christians, promising them that he would bring them to Jerusalem, that they should give him his money, and he was the biggest thing, the biggest deal going on. And people would donate everything they had to him with the promise and the hope that he would lead them to Israel. He would lead them to the promised land, lead them from Indonesia. One of the craziest things that happened was remember this, it was in March of 2016, he just dropped dead. I don't remember how old he was, but he wasn't old. He was in his late mid-40s, and he just died of whatever. He just drop dead. And that was a very, very big deal. The biggest preacher in Indonesia dies, and not only does he die, but remember, he had all these promises and so on that he was going to lead the people of Indonesia. So a lot of Christians fell out. A lot of his followers just dropped it and moved away from it. But then it just took a day or two for some Christians, and for some reason, the people I knew who did this, who was in media, said that he appeared, this guy Peter the Great appeared to them in visions and dreams. They were all women, some strangely, and claimed that he had appeared to them, and it began a whole new thing that he was going to spiritually lead them. And that was like a bomb went off inside of me, because I thought, wow, this is what can happen. So the majority find this result to be a disconfirmation of everything, but yet some people just won't let go and then just reinterpret it in a whole new way. And then there's a small sect of his followers that continue. And we see this. I saw this in the Far East, not only in Indonesia, but the same kind of things you'll have in, let's say, in India. Very frequently, this kind of stuff happened. So that's likely what occurred. Of course, any person who would have held on to the idea that Jesus could be the Messiah would have been confronted by fellow Jews who would go, but what is the source? What is the basis for such a belief? Because this in no way comports. This in no way is consistent with the repeated message in the Hebrew Bible that the Messiah would bring about the ingathering of the exiles, not the expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem, the building of a temple, not the destruction of a temple. It would bring about a worldwide peace, not such upheaval. The resurrection of the dead, not so many would perish. And that's what early Christians were confronted with, and they had to come up with something. So that's why I think it's quite likely that that's why the church emerged in such a way. And Judaism was a rather popular religion in the first century. A lot of conversion to Judaism, a lot of interest in the Jewish faith, people losing hope in the gods of the Greco-Roman world. And no doubt, when early Christians were confronted by Jewish people, why do you hold on to such beliefs? They no doubt scoured the Jewish scriptures looking for any text which talks about anybody suffering, about King David describing his own suffering, and then use those passages, or passages like Isaiah 53, which describes the nations of the world speaking about the suffering of the Jewish people and how it triggered their repentance, and they were responsible for the suffering of the Jewish people, God's servant. When they came up with those kinds of passages to explain Jesus and the very, very primitive Christian movement, fireworks that's when the fireworks began, and that's why it exploded. So in a sense, they were stuck with a Jewish framework. In the same way, I think that the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the movement of Mormons in the 19th century, why did they have to use a Christian framework? Because it emerged from a country that was largely Christian. That was the milieu, and that's what it had to emerge from. You think about the Millerite sects that emerged, Christian sects that emerged in the 19th century, meaning in the late part of the 19th century, after the great disappointment of 1944. But why did the Seventh-day Adventists, the J Witnesses, Russell, all these groups, why did they have to emerge from Christianity? Why didn't they come out of, because that was the dominant religion. The word dominant is an understatement. So it's not hard to understand how people who desperately want to cling on to some sort of hope would look at texts in the Hebrew Bible, scour it to find anything that could in any way be construed to support the Christian claim. And this, of course, would make Jewish people even more uncomfortable with these beliefs. And then the church would have to explain why Jewish people are so adverse to this, why are they so offended by this. And then you would have, ideas like Paul, that in fact it is the fact that people find Christianity foolish and a stumbling block that demonstrates that it's true. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18 through 25. You see this reflected in the Gospels, this very strong anti-Jewish sort of refrain. He came to his own, but they received him not. And that emerges in the prologue of John. In fact, the prologue of John and throughout the book of John is really a story about the Jewish rejection of Christianity. Throughout the Gospels, I think what people don't get if they're not reading the Christian text, particularly the Gospels, is how anti-Jewish it is. When you read John chapter 9 as an example, a chapter, essentially we are told that Jesus heals a man who is blind from birth. So you think that's like the main thrust of the story is that Jesus was able to, by taking clay and spittle and putting it on his eyes and tell him to go wash himself, and suddenly he could see. That should be the most striking part of John chapter 9. But if you actually take out the time to read this chapter, what comes across with much stronger force is not that this man who's blind from birth was supposedly healed. What is very striking is that the Jews wouldn't believe it. And not only that the Jews were opposed this completely, and that the very family of the blind man were terrified of the Jews and were scared because the Jews would throw you out of the synagogue if they knew that you believed in Jesus. I mean, and of course, I always tell my viewers, just like read it for yourself. What comes through in that chapter, I'm just picking that as an example, but it's constant, just constantly comes up, is more than the miracle that Jesus is purported to have done, is that the Jews reject him. A prophet is not without honor except from his own countrymen. That refrain is over and over again. So the New Testament is the Gospels, because that's where you find the storytelling, the Gospels, right, and say the book of Acts. And in the storytelling, the Jews are ever present. Basically, it's hard to find a story where the Jews are not playing some very important role, and it's not a good one. The Jews are at every stage trying to undermine God's plan. It's a shock that Christians hate us as little as they do, because when you read these texts, you would only walk away and think that the Jews are the most horrible people in the world. So that's how I think what is most likely this emerged, that the Jews ultimately are enemies of God, and they were miraculously blinded, and there was a veil over their eyes, as you'd find in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. The same thing carries over into chapter 4. This, bear in mind, is precisely what is not supposed to occur in the Messianic age. And I'll just bring this to a full circle. The message in the Hebrew Bible and the prophets, who were the vessels of God to convey his eternal oracles, they declared that the non-Jews would come to the Jews to find out the truth. And 10 of them would grab the hem of the shirt of a Jew, Knaf Yehudi, Zechariah 8:23, and they would say, "Take us with you, for now you've heard that God is with you." So it's vital for people who are very interested in this topic to look at the Jewish scriptures, look at passages in Jeremiah 16, where we're told that the mark of the end of days is that the non-Jews would learn from the Jewish people how to worship God, and they would regret their former worship. The precise opposite of the message that comes up over again repeatedly in the Gospels and also in the letters of Paul. But we're seeing something marvelous today. We're seeing a growing interest in Judaism among Christians today, and many of them are coming to know about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I believe that we're living in a time, let us hope, that we should merit to see the coming of the true Messiah quickly in our time. Thank you for that question.
Indeed, indeed. All right, Rabbi, we'll go ahead and move on. Guys, when you call in, be sure to don't hang up once you get through. If you do, you'll probably have to try. It's like playing Russian roulette. We only have one way to answer, and that is one phone call at a time. The others I think they get pushed to voicemail, I'm guessing. So just kind of keep trying. If you go to voicemail, just keep trying in. That's the best way to do it. Caller, you're live on the air. Please tell us your name, where you're calling from.
Hi, this is Van again from Cincinnati, Ohio,
Welcome.
USA. The question today has to do with Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, where it talks about, for a child will be born to us, wonderful counselor, mighty God, eternal Father, Prince of Peace, those types of things. Just two chapters earlier, in chapter 6, it's talking about the child Emmanuel, King Ahaz, I think, whatever, Ahaz, and a young woman will give birth, and his name will be Emmanuel. Why do we have? Are these two verses supposed to be related to each other somehow? I mean, just two chapters apart, we have a prophecy about somebody coming along, whether it's a Messiah or not. And I'm just trying to figure out if there's some kind of relationship theologically or historically or whatever between these two accounts. And also when it talks about in chapter 7, when it talks about Emmanuel, my understanding is that the word Emmanuel has been mistranslated traditionally. Instead of God with us, it means God is with us. And therefore, when the king looks at the child, he will be reminded that God, not that this child is God, but that this child's name means that God is with us, and I don't have to worry about being invaded from this other country. So, if the rabbi could address those two components, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. You can go ahead and hang up now and tune in for your answer. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. All right, man.
Those are the kinds of questions that I dream and hope that someone would call in with, because I wait a lot of time, wait a considerable amount of time for someone to call in with a question as thoughtful as that one. I don't recall your name. I'm very grateful that you asked it. So as it turns out, people are given names in Tanakh. And these names are very, very important. They're very significant, especially not just the names of Jewish people, which very frequently have God's name in it and a description of God, like my name. My name is Tovia, which means the goodness of God. My parents named me after my great-grandfather who perished in the Holocaust, but they surely hoped that in some way my life would reflect God's goodness. But this theophoric method of names reflecting God's will is everywhere in these texts. And Isaiah chapter 7 and Isaiah chapter 9 are not just related, they're juxtaposed by the prophet. They're placed side by side for a very important reason. We know that these names are given to the children of prophets because they are signs and symbols to the Jewish people. It says so explicitly right in between. Remember, you mentioned Isaiah 7 and Isaiah 9. If we go to the chapter that is between the two, Isaiah chapter 8, in verse 18, Isaiah says, Hine anoichi v'hayelodim asher nosati le'Hashem l'ois u'lemoifsim b'Yisrael. Behold, I and the children that you gave me are for signs and for portents among the children of Israel. I mean, the purpose of these names are as signs and portents for the children of Israel. And as it turns out, in just 10 verses earlier, you're quite right. The name Emmanuel is there to say that God is protecting you. God, in both of these cases, is protecting the Davidic dynasty. Utsu Eitza V'Sufa, this is Isaiah 8, verse 10, let them, in this case, the them are the enemies of the people of Israel, let them come up with an Eitzah, like a plot, to plan a plot, the Sufa, and it will come to naught. Dabru Davar, let them say a plan, V'lo Yakum, it will not be established. Why? And here you see the play on words, Ki Umanuel, because God is with us. So you see explicitly the name God is with us is a name that indicates, that points to that God will deliver the Jewish people, that he will keep his promise. Ki Umanuel. That's what the name Emmanuel is. It doesn't mean in a Greco-Roman sense that there are man gods walking around like Pythagoras and Hercules and emperors of Rome, who people as wicked as Vespasian were thought to be the son of God. Not in that sense at all. Look at the text for yourself. The text is telling you that God is keeping a promise, and we'll talk about that promise in a moment, because he's with you and he will not abandon you. Now, there's another section of the Jewish people who, in fact, would lose their ability to stay in the land of Israel. At the very same time, the northern kingdom were carried away by the Assyrian Empire, by Tiglath-Pileser, and eventually by Sennacherib during the reign of Hezekiah. And in fact, the prophet who was sent to the northern kingdom, Hosea, names his children with names that indicate their doom. I will not have mercy on you. You're not my people. You will not be seated. So Hosea and Isaiah were contemporaries. They live in the exact same time. Isaiah was a prophet to the southern kingdom, predominantly to the southern kingdom, meaning the kingdom of Judah. At the very same time, roughly 2,700 years ago, a little bit more, Hosea was in the north with another prophet named Amos, and Hosea had children whose names indicated the doom of the northern kingdom. Now you see how this really is so lovely and just works out perfectly. Hosea is instructed to marry a prostitute. Why? Because as a symbol for the prostitution, spiritual prostitution of his audience, the northern kingdom, Isaiah's wife, we know in Isaiah chapter 8, was not just a woman, but she was a prophet in her own right. And she's the one who's instructed in Isaiah 7, verse 14, to name her son that hasn't yet been born, but she's already pregnant, Emmanuel. That's masked in Matthew 1:23. Just a side note, because Mary never calls Jesus Emmanuel, so in Matthew 1:23, it's changed to, and they will call his name Emmanuel. That massive pronoun change is going to make it possible for Christians to buy this, including many other very famous alterations to this text. Now, the question is, why are these events juxtaposed side by side? There actually is a considerable amount of time between two. It's not a huge amount, it's not centuries, but there's a considerable amount of time between them, decades. So they both have, God is delivering both kings, Ahaz, who was a very, very wicked king, and his son Chizkiyahu, Hezekiah, who's a very, very righteous king, God is making good the promise that he made to their great-grandfather, King David. That's the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12 through 16. God promised King David, King David lived, let's say, 300 years earlier, that the Davidic covenant would never pass away, that even your descendants who are wicked, although they will be punished personally, but the covenant will never be taken away from them. And that means your dynasty is forever and ever. So what the prophet is doing here is what Tanakh does repeatedly in so many instances, and that is it has zvugim, which means zvugim means couples or couplets. In this sense, you have two stories that are very similar. You would have in David and Shaul, you would have in the book of Samuel, but in this case you have Achaz and then Chizkiyahu, one right after the other. In both cases, these Davidic kings were threatened by an enemy. In the case of Achaz, the enemy was the northern kingdom in an unusual alliance with Syria against the southern kingdom, against Achaz in Jerusalem. And in the second instance, it wasn't the northern kingdom, but in the second instance, because the northern kingdom is gone, it's not Damascus, they're gone, but it is the Assyrian Empire who is now seeking to destroy Chizkiyahu, seeking to destroy the Davidic dynasty. So in both cases, what they share in common is that the Davidic dynasty was threatened. Had either, in the case of Isaiah 7, the northern kingdom in its alliance with Damascus, with Syria, had they succeeded, the Davidic dynasty would have been destroyed. 2 Samuel 7, the promise would have been shattered, would have been undone. That can't happen. In the second instance, had Sancherib accomplished what he set out to do, and that is destroy the Davidic dynasty by destroying Jerusalem, again, the promise made to King David would have been shattered. So in both cases, what they have in common, it's not only striking, this is the big issue in both cases, that God delivers both. What is a little bit, it's not that subtle really, if you study it, is that God delivers them in different ways completely. In the case of Achaz, he was wicked. He didn't deserve to be saved. So in the case of Achaz, essentially Pekah and Ritzin, the two kings who came against him, were essentially murdered and were assassinated. Just a very, it was just not very notable at all. You'll find it in the Book of Kings, but it's just occupies a few verses. There's no miracles, nothing like that. In the case of Chizkiyahu, in the case of Hezekiah, because he was righteous and deserved to be delivered, so in that case, the greatest miracle since the Exodus occurs, with the entire Assyrian army, 185,000 soldiers, are killed by an angel of death on the first night of Passover. So you can see how God delivers. They're both delivered, but in very different ways. But the names are very critical, because the names are always that God will preserve you. In the case of Chizkiyahu, in the case of Hezekiah, Hezekiah is given the name Wonderful Counselor. The mighty God is literally the name of Hezekiah. Chizkiyahu literally means the mighty God. So we have this very important king who, because of Hezekiah's behavior, the children of Israel were delivered in such a miraculous way. Whereas in the case of his father, who was very, very wicked, the Davidic dynasty was not delivered because of Achaz, but they were delivered despite Achaz. Now, the church would move on to make alterations to these texts. So in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6 and 7, or 5 and 6, the Christian Bible and Jewish Bible cut the chapters differently. It's the same passages. The church would go all out on this. Now, the writers of the New Testament didn't do any of this because these passages were not yet corrupted or not yet used by the earliest Christians. First century Christians, it never occurred to them that you could misappropriate these passages that are referring to Hezekiah and use them for Jesus. They didn't come up with that. We know that because you won't find that quoted in the New Testament. You'll find passages from Isaiah 9 or the end of Isaiah 8 in the book of Matthew. That's there. They knew. It's not like they didn't have the book of Isaiah. Just it didn't occur to them that we can come up with this scam. But later on, the church does come up with this scam, and what they'll do then is change the verbs in the text from the past tense, because the nation, imagine being delivered from the Assyrian army. Imagine nearly 200,000 soldiers. You know what that means, 200,000 soldiers? Even in the modern age, that would be something very strange. Imagine nearly 200,000 soldiers surrounding you, and it's not any army, but it's the superpower. You didn't have a chance. You had nothing, and they succeeded in just carrying away the northern kingdom. They wiped out the Judean cities like Lachish and so on. You didn't have. All you had was a prayer. That's all you had. There was no possible way of. So you can imagine that how grateful the children of Israel were. In this case, it was the Jews, because they were from Judea. How grateful they were to Chizkiyahu, who advised them so well, who was so instrumental in the manner that they were delivered. They would have been delivered in any way, but to be delivered in such a manner, this, and you will find this, I encourage you to read in particular 2 Kings chapter 18 and 19. In fact, 2 Kings just starts out, the chapter 18 by telling us that Hezekiah, just read verse 4 and 5, was the greatest Davidic king that had ever lived. Means no one prior to him was as great as Chizkiyahu, and no king following him was as great. No one. He was the greatest of all. I don't say it. It's in the text. So if you take the time to read 2 Kings chapter 18 and 19, you can take the time to read passages that are more prose, are using standard prose and what you'd be used to from the earlier prophets, like Isaiah 36 and 37. So you'll see how instrumental front and center was Hezekiah is in this enormous crisis and this marvelous miracle. So that's why these names are used all over the place, because the theophoric method, meaning using names of God in the names of people to speak about God and his greatness. You can see this with Daniel and his companions. They all had names, Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, that had God's name in it. And look at the names that Nebuchadnezzar gave them instead, renamed them, names that did not possess the name of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You can see how large this looms in Tanakh, that the names of people carry a divine message. Now, will Christians exploit this down the pike and go, you see there? Yes, they would, because they've got to prove the impossible, and that is that there's a man God walking around, which is something that's completely antithetical to the message of the prophets of Israel. That's a really great question. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right, very good. We'll go ahead and move on to the next caller. Caller, you are live on the air. Please tell us your name and where you're calling from.
Hello, this is David from New York.
David, welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. My question was actually exactly this kind of topic.
Excellent.
You mentioned about the fact that this entire thing had to happen because the promise made to David. So you have all this entire thing that go on. Somebody that wasn't worthy gets saved. Only a couple hundred years later, it does come to an end. Why did this entire thing have to happen to save Achaz? And then later on, the Davidic dynasty gets destroyed by the Babylonians. and then there is no Davidic dynasty during the Second Temple. So there's no line of David going through. So if the promise was to David that your line won't end and you're going to be sitting there forever, how did that happen? And then why would it happen now as opposed to then? Or why wouldn't it have happened now as opposed to then?
So let me keep you on, if I may, William, if that's what we just for a second.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's true that there were no Davidic kings during the Second Temple period, but I can tell from your voice, you know very well that the Davidic dynasty continued well throughout the Second Temple period, and we have a bit of Second Temple history in Tanakh itself. So it's true there were no kings during the Second Temple. It's true that a person like Zerubbabel wasn't a king. He was a governor, but he was a descendant of King David. Moreover, you know very well that even after the temple was destroyed, there was a Reish Galusa that continued in Bavel, in Babylon, where the Davidic dynasty was preserved. Bear in mind that the prophecy that we have, whether it's in 2 Samuel, you can even trace it back to Genesis chapter 49, verse 8, 9, and really 10, are not saying that there would never be a moment in history where there would be no king. It's just whenever there would be a king that was legitimate, it would have to come from this house of David. So the Davidic dynasty is very much with us. It is possible. I don't know you, but you probably know people who are very aware of the fact that they're descendants of King David.
No, I wasn't mentioning about the descendants.
So the kingship comes to not an end, but to a pause, and it will be restored at the end of days, as is prophesied in Hosea chapter 3, verse 4 and 5, that there'll be a very long period of time, Hosea 3 and 45, where there'll be no king, no sacrifice, no offerings, and so on, no high priest, until the end of days, when it would be restored, and the people of Israel, the Jewish people, return back to God and David, the prince.
So that would be the answer then.
Would be an interruption in between.
No, but then it could have happened by Achaz. The pause could have been then. I thought the entire purpose of the reason why they were saved was not to break the line and not to have a pause. If there could have been a pause, then why couldn't the pause have happened by Achaz?
Sure. I'm glad I'm keeping you on. What did Pekah and Ritzin want to do? If you read the text, what do they want to do? Did they just want the kingship to come to a pause, or did they want to kill Achaz and destroy his dynasty, which nearly happened a number of times? These are not the only two events with that clear.
Right.
So if you look, what was Assyria committed to? They were interested in destroying the Davidic dynasty, and they weren't interested in a pause. They were interested in completely destroying the Davidic dynasty. Had they succeeded, there would be no descendants of King David. It would have come to an end. I mean, read the text, and you'll see that was very much what they were interested in doing. Deliver us Achaz. Deliver us Chizkiyahu.
I definitely agree and definitely understand that part, but that was the same concept they wanted to do later on also. There's always a constant aspect of destroying that dynasty by each of the conquerors, which was the reason why I think that one of them killed all the children. They thought they killed everybody out, but from the line they thought. But the same way that it saved till, like we say, that there are dead descendants today, it could have happened the same exact way with Achaz. In other words, the same thing could have happened. In other words, they could have gone ahead, destroyed them, not been saved at that point because they weren't worthy, quote unquote. But it seemed that what Isaiah was saying is, at least from what it sounded like, is that they should be saved because of that promise. And if the promise didn't save them later, why was the problem with saving them then? Because it could have happened the same exact way.
So let me bounce this off you. Let me just bounce this off you, because I want to reframe this and see if this works for you. Because maybe we'll go in circles on this. Let me rephrase this and tell me if we can. The question really is why during the first temple was there a a king, and why was there no king during the Second Temple period and the period that would follow, then that's the real question. The dynasty is preserved despite enormous troubling events that would occur. But the real question then is, why is there no king at all during the Second Temple? And that means God is keeping a king around. You're right. I mean, this point, you're right on target on this. So your question is, why is God I'm just using a sense, kaviyachol, God is working really hard over time to preserve the IOU node, to keep a king going continuously. In case of Achaz or Hezekiah for 29 years, like, why is God ensuring that the king is not removed? In the Second Temple, there was no king at all, as there were king people who proclaimed to be king who shouldn't, whether it was the Maccabean family or Herodian family, but they were illegitimate. So that's then your real question. Why did God not do in the Achaz time what God did during the Second Temple time? Now I got your question. Okay.
Yes.
So thank you. Right now I got it. Okay. Thank you. I was trying to.
Yeah. Go ahead and hang up now. You get your answer.
Okay.
Thanks. Okay.
So now I sort of I had to tease that out to get the question. So the Davidic dynasty can't be destroyed, but as it turns out, like, why did God persist in preserving a Davidic king throughout the First Temple period? And there were prophets always there, because the main role of a prophet was to not only advise but admonish the king, and that's what got them in a lot of trouble. And in a sense, you see that prophecy comes to an end at the same time when kings come to an end. It means there's no Davidic kings. Their grandchildren were there, but they were not elevated to a king. And the reason is that Mashiach could have come during these times. So this is a very good question and a very important point that I would like to bring out. So, in fact, as we know, the Gemara tells us, in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that Chizkiyahu, Hezekiah himself, was worthy to be the Messiah. And in fact, Mashiach could have come if he would have said Shira, if he and the people would have recited the songs of deliverance that, for example, Moses did at the parting of the sea. I don't want to digress and wonder why there was no Shira sung, why there was no song that was proclaimed at that time. But what is clear is that at any juncture, it was waiting. Like the chamber was, the gun was chambered, and at any moment the trigger could have been pulled. And it was very important during the First Temple period that every king was preserved, no matter how they behaved. Whether they behaved like Chizkiyahu, who was a tzaddik, and Mashiach could have come in a moment. It didn't, but it almost did. Or in the days of Achaz, who reigned for a much shorter time, but we had to preserve because Mashiach could have come. In fact, Mashiach could have even come during the days of Ezra, could have come that late. And the Gemara, for sources on this, I would encourage you to go to the Talmud Nesota 36, where it tells us that Mashiach could have even come in the days of Ezra. Ultimately, because the Jews did not live up to the standard that was necessary for Mashiach to come, he didn't come. They were instead goyim hachet, which means that they continued sinning. And what that means, more specifically, is that not enough Jews came into the land of Israel. And that displayed a weakened generation. As it turns out, during the Second Temple period, when the Jews returned under the order of Cyrus, as prophesied hundreds of years earlier, we know from the opening of the book of Ezra, chapter 2, that only 42,360 Jews, out of probably millions of Jews in Babylon, moved to Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, they weren't worthy of Mashiach. And that's why prophecy came to an end at that point. Why did prophecy end with Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi? the three prophets who were the true latter prophets who lived and preached during the Persian Empire. Why did Hashem keep them around? Because there was a potential for Mashiach to come. So as long as there was a potential for Mashiach to come, so then we need prophets and we need to keep a king around. The first temple was such a time. The moment that wasn't possible any longer, so then you didn't have a king, a sitting king. And as it turned out, during the Second Temple period, with the exception of 99 years, the Jewish state was a vassal country under the shlita, under the sovereignty of either the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire. There was a period, the Maccabean period, but then the Roman Empire, when Pompey enters Jerusalem, and of course, that will be the end of any hope. So that potential was not there, but that's a good question. Hashem preserved a king on the throne because at any time Mashiach could have come at that time. Now the Mashiach will be triggered in a different fashion where the Jewish people will be in the land of Israel, as we see in Zechariah chapter 12 as an example. Ezekiel 38 and 39 as an example. It's really, this is found pretty much all over the place. And then nations will come to attack the land of Israel, Yerushalayim, and then the Jews will engage in a war. The enemies will be defeated, and from that, Mashiach will emerge in a very different way. And this is prophesied by Hosea in chapter 3, verse 4 and 5. There are many other prophecies like that, but thank you for that question.
All right, moving on to the next caller. Caller, you're live on the air. Please tell us your name, where you're calling from.
Hi, this is Josh from the UK.
Welcome, Josh.
Hope you're doing well, Rabbi. Thank you, William. So my understanding of Avodah Zarah is, in Tanakh, would involve the worship of other gods or making inanimate images to represent the divine. So in Parashat Weit Hanan, in Deuteronomy 5, it says, "Lo ta'aseh lecha fasal kol timuna asher b'shamayim, lo tishtahwa lahem, ulo ta'avdem, ki anochi Adonai Elohecha." You shall not make yourself a carved image or likeness, anything that is in heaven above. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. Also in Psalm 115, عصبيهم كاسف zahav معسي يدي آدم بيلهم ولو يدبروا عينيهم لهم ولو يرؤوه. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak, and eyes do not see. So in other words, my understanding is that those gods are inanimate, that neither benefit nor harm. This is the problem. I was listening to you talking about King Hezekiah, who smashed the bronze serpent that the people of Israel were making offerings to, calling it Nehushtan, that Moshe made, because that was Avodah Zarah. Now, on the other hand, part of the 5 major mitzvot that the Muslims have is going in circles around a building, and they believe that Abraham Avinu built it in the Arabia, which contains a black stone brought to Abraham by the angel Gabriel. So to this day, Muslims kiss it, touch it, and they hope for forgiveness of sins because of that. When the Caliph, the third Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, was doing this Islamic mitzvah, talking to the black stone, he said, إني أعلم أنك حجر ما تنفع ولا تضر ولولا أني رأيت رسول الله يقبلك ما قبلتك. I know that you are just a stone and that you neither do harm nor benefit. Had I not seen the messenger of Allah, Muhammad, kissing you, I would not have kissed you. This is an authentic hadith that Sunni Muslims believe. Umar sounds like he's acknowledging what the psalmists say. They have eyes and do not see. And this is not like kissing the mezuzah. It's an act of worship involving a stone that allegedly came down from heaven as white stone and became black because of the sins of the people. Now, the question is, Muslims also have, answers to this, to do away with the charge of idolatry. The question is, don't you find it, Rabbi, and I'm saying it with all due respect, don't you find it inconsistent that you believe that Muslims are not idolaters while they pray 5 times facing a stone that historically was worshipped by the pagans, but you say that Christians are idolaters because of a philosophical speculation of God's nature? Now, if I ask Hezekiah, what would you do if, let's say, indeed Abraham received it or made this black stone? What would you do, like he did to the Nehushtan?
Let me do this. I confess that it's a little difficult follow. I got it all. I think I have your question there.
You can go and hang up now and tune in for their
All right.
answer if you don't mind. Thanks. Okay.
I think I got your question.
Go right ahead, Rabbi.
So, yeah. So, as it turns out, I've never been to Saudi Arabia, and I certainly have not gone to Mecca. Non-Muslims are not permitted to enter there. But what I did is I spend a lot of time talking to Muslims, and Muslims repeatedly convey the same message to me, that to them, their experience in the Hajj and circling the Kaaba 7 times in a counterclockwise fashion, and there are many rituals that Muslims go through during their Hajj, that in no way are they worshiping this place. That's right. This is a Muslim tradition, and it's best that you really consult Muslim scholars on this. But Muslims believe that this is a place that traces itself back to Abraham, and became in Islamic view a place, unfortunately, of idol worship, and then it was restored to a holy place of monotheism. But I spent time, I have a lot of friends who are Muslims, and you just ask them about the experience and ask them about what it's like many times, and they all conveyed the same message. And that is that to them, they're kissing the stone and so on is not in any way a form of worshiping the stone. On the contrary, they see this as a place that was cleansed of idolatry. It was in the 7th century a place where there were hundreds of gods, but it was cleansed of that. And it's a way of showing enormous affection and love for God. And I don't have any. And interestingly, that in many of the conversations that I've had, many of them with Muslim scholars, they would often use the Western Wall as an example for Jewish people as a holy site. And we do, when praying there, we kiss the stone, as a sign of affection. Not that we believe the stone is anything and the stone has any intrinsic holiness in itself, although we believe the Shekhinah, the presence of God, is there and never left that area according to our tradition. And that's what Muslims tell me, and I don't have a reason to doubt that. So I have never met a Muslim, and I'm not saying he or she is not out there. I'm not saying that, and perhaps it is a problem that Muslim leaders have to confront. But every Muslim I've asked, some of them are really, really close friends of mine, who've gone on the Hajj, who've said, this is a symbol of our affection for God, and we're expressing it this way. And in fact, it is not essential for them during this circumnavigation of the Kaaba. It's not essential for them to kiss it, but they do as a sign of their affection, but not as worshiping the stone. To the Muslim, this is not only not true, it's ridiculous. Muslims respond to this viscerally, in shock that anyone would even think that they're worshiping the stone. But again, I'm not a Muslim, and I'm not a scholar of Islam, and you may want to pose that to a Muslim scholar, but I've really spoken to a lot of Muslims about it. It's not something I can't go there, but it's very clear this is how Muslims are processing this. Anyways, thank you for your question.
All right, very good. Moving on to the next caller. Caller, you're live on the air. Please tell us your name. Where are you calling from? Caller, you're live on the air. Okay, let's take the next caller. Caller, you're live on the air. Please tell us your name. Where are you calling from? Hello, hello. 1 second. Caller, you're live on the air. Please tell us your name. Where are you calling from? That's really strange. Oh, hold on a second. I'm such a dork. I have a new soundboard, and I actually have mute buttons, so I don't have to use the sliders. And I was going to turn it up and down, and it was muted the whole time. Sorry. Caller, you're live on the air. If you called in and I hung up on you, I'm very sorry. I'll try not to do that again. You're live on the air. Please tell us your name and where you're calling from. Now watch them not talk. All right, can you hear us now? You're live on the air. There we go.
Hello?
There we go. All right. Welcome. You're live on the air. You have a question for Rabbi?
Yes, this is Michael Purdy from Baton Rouge.
Hey, Michael. Welcome back, sir.
How y'all doing today?
Doing good. What's up?
Rabbi, I have a question.
It kind of has to do, I guess, with the previous caller's question. Also, you had posted a video last week about the caller that called about the same question about Christians being idolaters. And I would just like to kind of expand on his question. Is it a sin if a Christian believes they are really truly worshiping God correctly, even though they maybe technically be committing idolatry? Does God judge them for that? That's my question.
Rabbi, clear?
Yeah.
Okay. Michael, go ahead and hang
That's
up now and
clear.
get you in for your answer, okay?
And
Okay.
All right,
I just, all right. So while it's very clear in the Tanakh that people who just don't know anything are never held accountable for their behavior, and we see that very clearly in the Torah. There are incidents where just someone didn't know. Like somebody didn't know that Sarah was Abraham's wife, and he got a phone call. He got a call from God letting him know, and so while that's true, the belief, the Christian belief, is opposed by the Jewish scriptures, and every Christian ought to know about that because they hold the Jewish scriptures to be the word of God. So let me just make sure I say that correctly. So that every Christian believes that Tanakh is the word of Hashem, and they're called upon to worship one God and no other, and therefore Christians spiritually are in a grave position. Now, as far as people just believing that they're monotheists and they're not, and that should play some role, I'll tell you a very interesting story. So, as you know, I lecture extensively in really many parts of the world. And I'm not sure, but I don't think I really offend people because the Christians who come to my lectures know what they're getting. It's not like I'm sort of, there to talk about the festival of Hanukkah and suddenly they get, they understand when Christians attend my lectures, they want to know why doesn't Judaism accept the Christian Messiah? And so everybody understands why I'm there. What's the point of the lecture? So I don't know, I never asked, but my sense is that people usually are not like offended. They, many people repent as a result of these wonderful programs. There are people who tend to be a polarizing figure who might not like me very much, but I'll tell you a funny thing. I don't think I ever told the story of when I really offended someone in the audience. I was lecturing in Bali. Now, Bali, an island, one of 17,000 islands in Indonesia, it's very famous. So Bali has a number of colleges, a number of universities. I don't remember the names, but I was an invited speaker. Now, this is the Far East. I'm not that familiar with like what's going on in Bali that much. I mean, it's not. So I was speaking, and we had these college students. I forget the name of the college. And as I was speaking, there was a young fellow who was clearly very upset. And by the time I finished the lecture, and after I took questions, he was right there, he began to cry. He was so upset. He was a young fellow. And I right away went over to him. I asked him what's wrong. As it turns out, during the lecture, I said that Hinduism is idolatry. And he was very, very insulted by that, very offended by that. And he said, because Bali, in case you didn't get the memo, is home to a very large Hindu community. It's predominantly Hindu, not all, but predominantly Hindu. And in fact, they're very, very religious Hindus. I'm told that they're even much more religious in general than those that you'll find in India, the birthplace of Hinduism. But as it turns out, he believed that Hinduism was a complete monotheism. And he said, not only are we monotheists and not idolaters, but he said that Hinduism is the oldest monotheism in the world. And I was like just blown away by that, because I never even knew that any Hindu would lay stake to being monotheist when Hinduism at the very top has a triad of gods, kind of like what you have in the Trinity, not spelt out exactly the same way, but you'd expect to find the triad there, and you do. But there really are a whole range of gods in the Hindu pantheon. There's the monkey god, the elephant god, and let me just tell you, if you haven't been to Bali, there's idols everywhere. You're not allowed to pray in front of an idol. Let's say there's an idol there. In Jewish law, you're not allowed to even pray in the presence of an idol. And in Bali, in order for me to pray to God, I had to really close my hotel room, because there was no place where you can walk where there wasn't a Hindu statue. It's just really everywhere. So, and then I was just very stunned by this. I was very perplexed that any Hindu would believe that Hinduism is not idolatry, because there's statues and they believe in so many gods, although they believe in a supreme God. So it's kind of like there is a kind of henotheism there, but there really is a whole series of gods in the Hindu sketch of everything. And to think that Hinduism is not only a monotheism, but the oldest monotheism, that was like really shocking, because how did that happen? The Torah was given much earlier than the religion of Hinduism began, although Hindus differ and argue over precisely when did the Hindu religion begin. That's a whole different order. But as it turns out, all the nations are called upon to worship one God, and Christians, more than anyone, will be held accountable for the purity of their worship, and to leave the Christian religion, to abandon it completely, because they, more than anyone, are most familiar with Judaism. More than any other religion, with the exception of Islam, they are the most familiar with the contents of the Jewish scriptures, because the Christian Bible routinely quotes the Hebrew Bible. And therefore, it's vital for Christians to look at the Jewish scriptures, to examine it, and to examine their mode of worship, and to conclude that there's one Hashem and there is no other God, there's no one besides him, no one, and to abandon and to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu only, the creator of the heavens and the earth alone. Now, if someone really doesn't know anything, so I'm not God's manager, I'm a salesman. That's already between man and God. But my job, my role, is certainly to teach about the one God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, with the hope that people would listen and would abandon any false monotheism, which Christianity surely is. Christianity really is a henotheistic religion that calls itself monotheistic, but it certainly is not. So thank you for your question.
All right, we got time for one more, I believe. So caller, you're live on air. Please tell us your name and where you're calling from.
Hi, this is David from South Florida.
David, welcome back. How are you?
Thank you so much. My question is about Esau.
Okay.
We know that from Genesis that Esau was technically the firstborn son of Jacob, but that he sold his birthright for a pot of soup, and then later Isaac gave the blessings to Jacob during part of the deception. So Esau becomes Edom, and Edom becomes Rome, and Rome is the church. So is there an element to the church's replacement theology, which is trying to take back that firstborn status from Israel? And does that make Esau and Edom and all those kind of a tragic figure in a certain way? Like they could have had it, but they gave it up. They're trying to get it back. That's my question.
That's a very interesting question. All right, go ahead and Rabbi, you get the question clear?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And you can go ahead and hang up now. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
All right, guys, this will be the last topic for today. So, Rabbi, take it away.
We're told very clearly that there are 4 noted kingdoms that would subjugate the Jewish people. We see this in many books of Tanakh. Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then this Edom, this final kingdom, whose destruction is prophesied in Tanakh. In the Jewish scriptures, the last kingdom is the worst of all. And then when Daniel, of blessed memory, sees an image of something that has 10 horns with an 11th, something just horrible, he's bothered by this deeply and engages the angel to further explain what this could possibly be. And this is the final kingdom that would subvert the Jewish people. But it, like the statue in Daniel that has a gold head and a silver chest and bronze legs and clay and iron for feet, that final kingdom is one that's divided and divided and divided again. It's something that can't be clearly identified because it's constantly morphing, and that's what Esau is. It's the implacable enemy of God, the enemy of the Jewish people, so much so that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says in the opening of the book of Malachi that HaKadosh Baruch Hu utterly hates Esau, utterly despises him. In a sense, Edom is grotesque, partially because it displays itself as being something kosher. Just as Esau displayed himself as being an authentic son, but in reality he was not, and sort of the pig who displays his mafresis parsis, split hooves, this is the nature of Edom. So Rome is that final kingdom that would subjugate and ultimately the Jewish people and destroy the Second Temple, but would change dramatically. Change. The most striking part of that history is in the 4th century, in 312, when Constantine becomes a Christian and initially makes Christianity a licit religion, a legal religion. And by the end of the 4th century, Constantine and the emperors that would follow would make Christianity the official religion of the empire, not banning Judaism altogether. Judaism was still a licit religion, but one in which there would be divisions and divisions over and over again. We can see that in the 11th century, the division between the East and the West, the Great Schism. Again, further schisms in the 16th century between the Catholic and Protestant Church, and those schisms would continue repeatedly. And that is the nature of Edom, the nature of Esau, is that it morphs, it changes constantly, but it is the implacable enemy of the Jewish people and the Jewish message, and seeks to destroy everything that's holy, both the law and the times. That's the nature of this final enemy, as described toward the end of the book of Daniel. And this remains to be our implacable enemy, and that's Rome. It's in the early church, Rome was a place where there were a lot of Christians, but contrary to what Catholics say, it wasn't the early bishops of Rome. They were not the Pope, but Rome was an extremely important part of the empire. But it's not an accident that the official language of the Roman Empire would become the official language of the Christian church. That's not how did that happen? And the most important, the translation, the scripture of the Roman Catholic Church with a capital S would be the Vulgate, whose primary translator, Jerome, would produce in the very early 5th century. He embarks on in late 4th and early 5th century. It's not an accident. This is all in Latin, the language of Rome. I mean, this is not a... And then Greece, our other enemy who sought to destroy us during the days of Antiochus Epiphanes IV in the 2nd century BC would come. They would produce the scripture, capital S, for the second largest Christian denomination in the world, the Orthodox Church. Imagine that. The language of Greece and the language of Rome, the official language, would become the language of the religions of these parts of the world. So a person has to be just shocked by this. This is not just another language. These are the religions. These are the languages that convey the idolatry of our implacable enemies. And this is who Edom is. And the prophecy clearly expressed in Tanakh is that they're going to ultimately be completely destroyed, and then we will have a full redemption. And please God, we will see that quickly in our time. Thank you for calling in.
Indeed, Rabbi, it was a great show. Thank you for your time as usual, and we'll look forward to seeing. How's our schedule looking as we're moving forward? I know we're coming into the holy days, and sometimes we hit those year cycles where we'll have like a lot of the holy days are falling in on Sundays. Are you that far ahead in your schedule to be able to tell how that's going to look this year?
I don't have a calendar in front of me, but next Sunday should be fine because it's between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
Sure.
So that should be just fine.
Okay, perfect.
I would have to have a calendar in front of me to look at the Festival of Tabernacles and see how that works out. We'll keep the viewers updated.
That sounds good. All right, you guys. Well, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and like the video if you don't mind. If you did like it, that is. They need to have a love button on there, baby. Yeah. Anyway, so y'all have a great week. Rabbi, you have a great week, and we'll see you on the other side. Shalom, everybody.